Welcome to a quick discussion of Resident Evil 2.
Resident Evil 2.
For its 25th anniversary, I wanted to look back at my favorite of the original Resident Evil trilogy. Resident Evil 2 was released for the PS1 in 1998. This is actually a slightly later version called the DualShock version that added rumble support and analog controls. Unlike the director's cut of Resident Evil 1, the soundtrack is also kept intact, so we don't have to worry about anything like the basement theme, though admittedly, the basement theme is definitely fun for how terrible it is. Resident Evil 2 was also released on a variety of platforms at the time, with varying results. Probably the best versions at the time were the Dreamcast and PC ports, but it was actually also released for the TigerElectronicsGame.com, which is probably the worst version hands down, but one of the most interesting versions was for the Nintendo 64. This is a dual-disc PS1 game. PS1 discs could hold more data than a Nintendo 64 cartridge anyway, so actually being able to compress everything down to fit both discs onto one cartridge was extremely impressive. It is kind of a technological marvel, even though it's also not a great way to play the game. Like, all of the content is intact, but obviously the graphics and sound have been heavily compressed to make everything fit on the N64 cartridge. But again, it is incredibly impressive that they were able to even port the game at all, even with many compromises. Later on, it was also re-released for the GameCube, and that version was actually heavily criticized at the time. And it wasn't because it was a bad port or anything, it was because the remake of the first game was already out. So going from a reimagining of RE1 to a port of RE2 was seen as a massive letdown. Speaking of the remake, Resident Evil 2 was actually not a game I played right away even after getting into the series, and the remake is part of the reason why. Basically, the games have different protagonists, so Resident Evil 1 stars Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine. The main characters of Resident Evil 2 are Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield, Chris's sister. So because Resident Evil 3 goes back to having Jill as the main character, I was actually more interested in that, and I skipped 2 and went straight to 3 at the time. Oddly enough, despite being interested in 3, I never finished it, and to this day, I've actually never finished the original version of RE3. I got to about the police station, and I stopped. That is actually extremely early into the game, and to tell the truth, I don't even remember why I stopped so quickly into the game. But yeah, I never really had much luck going back to it and trying to finish it even years later. After that, I actually wouldn't even play a Resident Evil for a long time. I didn't play any of the later games after that, and the next Resident Evil game I would actually play was this. By this point, the remake of 2 was in the works. This was announced around E3 2018, if I'm not mistaken, though it had been rumored a bit earlier because by that point the Resident Evil series was starting to regain momentum because of the success of RE7. Basically, after Resident Evil 6 and the sort of action shift that the series had taken since 4, increasingly so, was starting to cause a rift in like the fan base because of this being a horror series, and the gradual change to an action focus kind of was alienating. So Resident Evil 7 went back to more of a survival horror style. So with the popularity of RE7, then about a year later, Resident Evil 2 Remake was announced, and I was excited about it actually, but I was also really curious because the entire style of Resident Evil games had shifted between Remake 1 and Remake 2. So in the old school Resident Evil games, from the first game to Resident Evil 0 for GameCube, you have like fixed camera angles and tank controls. So like pressing up moves you forward, pressing down moves you backwards, and then left and right will turn. And yeah, you can't move the camera on your own. It'll shift automatically if you reach a certain point on the screen. So Resident Evil 4 shifted the series to more of an action focus, and with that, even though that game actually still kept the tank controls, it moved the camera to a third-person perspective, like an over-the-shoulder third-person game. So it was very different stylistically. RE4 is still considered one of the best games of all time, but it was definitely a significant change from the classic formula. So that meant that the remake of 2 would either have to go back to the old school fixed camera angle style or reimagine the entirety of the game into the over-the-shoulder perspective, which is the route that they ended up going with. The remake came out in, I want to say spring 2019, received extremely positive reviews, and I had seen a couple of playthroughs, and I really wanted to try it myself, but because I'm not traditionally into horror games, I waited for a price drop, basically. In the meantime, I played through Claire's route of Resident Evil 2 Original. I've actually never played Leon's route in this, to be honest, but I did a full playthrough of Claire's route. This is divided into two routes. There's the A route and the B route. So you have two combinations of either Claire A, Leon B, or Leon A, Claire B. Typically, Claire A, Leon B was considered like the canon route, so that's what I went with, though to be fair, I never played through the Leon B route. And yeah, I had a really good time with it. It actually really stood out to me how good this game has held up despite its age and despite a lot of limitations. So here we have this little puzzle where we have to like push these statues onto these switches in such a way that they're facing the statue in the middle of the room. It's a little clunky having to do this with tank controls. And that gives us this gem. To tell the truth, I also haven't even played Claire's route in a very long time, so I am definitely not an expert on navigating this area. Most of my knowledge of actually getting through the Raccoon City Police Department is just sort of applying what I know about the remake to this game, because I actually like the remake a lot. I was thinking about it, and Resident Evil 2 Remake is possibly one of my favorite games in the last, like, 5 or so years. I really enjoyed it, to be honest. Not counting A and B side playthroughs. If you count those as separate playthroughs, instead of, like, a joint playthrough of having to do the A side and the B side, Remake 2 is technically one of my most played games in recent memory. I've done like 10 or 11 playthroughs actually, because I enjoy it that much, though to be fair, again, that wasn't like a true ending playthrough. That was only up to like the ending of one of the A-side routes, but not like the full true ending. The story is actually one of the really interesting things about Resident Evil 2 Remake because of how it approaches some things. For example, over on this desk we have a diary from Chris, which has a very different tone than the message for Claire in the remake. In this version, it's presented very straightforward, where he's talking about the mansion incident from Resident Evil 1, and also talking about Umbrella's involvement, and eventually mentions going to Europe to try to stop Umbrella there, and like that he doesn't want Claire to find out. In the remake, this is presented in a much different way, which makes a lot more sense in universe, where he's being very coy about everything. Like, oh, he's just gonna take a vacation to Europe, and, you know, don't worry about him, he'll be fine, kind of a thing. And Claire even comments that it feels out of character, so it's kind of a way to signal that something is going on without being this overt about, like, oh yeah, there's a big conspiracy in Umbrella in Europe right now. So yeah, in general, it is very interesting tonally how the two games differ, but also the changes apply to the framing of the two routes, for better or worse. This is actually one of the most divisive parts of Resident Evil 2 Remake, and it's actually something I agree with, being done better in the original. So in the original, your actions in an A route actually affect the B route. Basically, there are certain items that if you pick up with one character, they won't be there for the other character. So you might want to leave like some ammo drops and things like that, just in case. The story also differs a little bit more. For example, in the remake, the story for both characters, regardless of A or B route, end up playing out basically the same. But there are actually major differences between a character's A route and their B route in the original. Like one change I'm aware of is for Leon's campaign, a character actually dies in a different way between the two routes. And for the longest time, the B-side route was actually accepted as the canon death of this character, though to be fair, the like phrasing it as the character dying is definitely like, yeah, this character comes back a lot, so they don't really die either way. But yeah, like the way it's framed is actually based on the B-side route in like the Dark Side Chronicles, which is like a light gun retelling of Resident Evil 2, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's Dark Side. There's Dark Side Chronicles and Umbrella Chronicles. I think Umbrella Chronicles was like RE1 and maybe 3, while Dark Side was like 2. And I think like an original campaign also. So yeah, it is interesting that the remake instead just goes for one interpretation of each story, which on one hand is a little bit of a letdown, but on the other hand makes sense just because, you know, modern game development is way more expensive and time consuming than it used to be. So actually having to make two separate versions of both characters' stories, meaning you have 4 different versions of each story, or of the story in total, that would be a lot. So again, I get why it's done this way, but I also admit that it is kind of a shame that things like the differences between the routes actually were not kept. Also, it creates plot holes, too, in the remake. There are definitely some cases where the plot actually doesn't even make sense because of not changing the B-side to account for what happened in the other character's A-side. So yeah, that's another downside of the remake's approach. But again, beyond that, I still think the remake is a great game, but again, it does actually fall short in some ways. Unlike the remake of the first game, which is like the same genre, I almost feel like because this is like a fixed camera angle, heavily tank-controlled game, there is actually more merit to going back and playing both versions of RE2 versus something like RE1. Again, RE1 definitely has its charm, but I have never really tried to play it, to be honest, because I started with the remake. While with this game, because there are some things that are done differently and the entire genre is different, I almost feel like it's more interesting to go back and play through both. I'm excited to see what happens with the remake of 4, because I feel like that has less differences, so it'll be interesting to see how they adapt a game that's already a third-person action game into, like, the modern Resident Evil formula. So I am curious about that. And then you have, like, the third remake, or the remake of 3, which is extremely polarizing. But, like, over here back in the main lobby, you have this, like, statue, which is part of a huge sequence in the remake still, but is actually a bit different. We only have 1 medal to collect. And instead of giving us a way out, this just gives us a key. So yeah, it is interesting how some things are in kind of an odd order, especially if, like me, you're more familiar with the remake than the original, and I'm sure it'd go the other way around, where if you're familiar with the original, some things about the remake would seem really odd. So yeah, the whole chain of events is like relatively well intact. Like the entire western wing of the precinct with like the liquor and like the zombies with the boarded up windows and like the office, and going into that like area with the stairs, and then you have like a save room right by the stairs. That whole sequence is extraordinarily faithfully recreated in terms of like the overall layout. You have the West Office, which is actually like locked for story reasons, but you also have this little area here, this desk area, but you also don't have like the East Wing. Now, like, there's nothing over here by the East Wing, which was a major point in the remake. Actually, having you go to the East Wing first was actually kind of cool, because that was a new part of the station. In terms of like going that way, going east instead of going west first. So that does create a very interesting dynamic of like, yeah, going the opposite direction than you normally would. Actually, first of all, I want to show off something else. Outside of the police station, there's actually a really fascinating Easter egg that also isn't in the remake. It makes sense, they actually moved it to RE3, and not as an Easter egg, but as a main story moment. But in this game, you start outside of the police station as usual, and you have a much larger sequence, because basically the sequence of getting to the police station was split up between two sections of the remake. So if you actually get through the entirety of it without actually picking up any items, you can actually fight a secret mini-boss of sorts against Brad, who is a character from Resident Evil 1. This obviously doesn't make sense for Resident Evil 3, because Brad shows up in that game in a very different context. But yeah, if you don't collect anything up to this point, you can fight Brad and get a special key. You can then take this key to the one locker room we found earlier and actually get an alternate costume for Claire, along with a special, like, gun. So it's a really cool Easter egg. Again, this was sort of incorporated into 3's main story, where you actually do fight Brad in that case, and you, I think, get a locker key there too, or like a key card or something. So yeah, it makes sense to move it to 3, but again, things like that, again, wouldn't make sense to include that as an Easter egg in 2 Remake, given the context of 3 Remake. 3 Remake in general was actually very polarizing because it didn't really adapt the original very accurately. I think as someone who hasn't played Resident Evil 3 in full, I actually like the remake, but I definitely can understand why someone wouldn't, because of how much was actually changed. But yeah, this game still holds up pretty well. There are definitely some quirks, like you can't quick turn, that was added with like Nemesis. You also have like a lot of like loading between stairs. You actually have to push a button to go up and down stairs, so it definitely doesn't flow particularly smoothly, but again, it kind of makes sense given the time. But yeah, in general, I think this game actually holds up shockingly well. Because the remake is so different, I kind of wish there was like a collection of the PS1 trilogy. Again, because they're so different from the remakes, especially Resident Evil 3 to the remake. But even in general, I think it actually would be pretty cool to have like a compilation of all of the classic titles. Yeah, that was a quick look at Resident Evil 2. Again, I think this game holds up surprisingly well, even as someone who prefers the remake because it's a little bit more modern and I'm more familiar with it. So yeah, with that being said, thank you for watching, and I hope you'll join me next time for another discussion.